On December 14, 1878, a woman sitting in a darkened German room glanced at the calendar and turned pale. The date marked exactly 17 years to the day since her own father had drawn his last breath in her arms. She was a daughter of Queen Victoria, a Grand Duchess who had devoted her entire existence to tending her loved ones through their dying moments. Now the illness claiming her had been contracted through a single, simple act: comforting her own grieving son. This is the story of that woman. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Crown Files. For those new to our channel, Crown Files explores the lives of women who dwelled in the shadow of power. The duchesses, the heirs' wives and daughters. Figures history remembers only through their connection to a famous name. Women who quietly paid the price for lives that glittered from the outside. Deep within a German vault, protected today by a private family foundation, rests a diamond tiara that has remained unworn for over half a century. It has endured 2 world wars, a divorce, and a coronation in Moscow. And as you will discover before this tale concludes, it outlasted a fire that claimed nearly everyone else in that room. Collectors and historians who study the piece have given it a nickname, half in jest: the cursed tiara. Others insist it merely holds too many memories. Yet before it became legend, it was simply a gift. A father designed it for his daughter's wedding, a present he did not live long enough to see her wear. It was Queen Victoria herself who ensured the piece was completed by the royal jewelers, Garrard, and delivered into her daughter's hands. The father was Prince Albert, the Queen's beloved husband. The daughter was Alice, their 3rd child and, by most accounts, the one who understood him most deeply. She would later write to her mother that she regarded her childhood as the happiest period of her life. She was not yet speaking of what awaited her. Albert's death in December of 1861 did more than end a marriage. It effectively suspended the normal functioning of the British monarchy. Queen Victoria retreated from public view for years. But there remained one person the grieving queen could not manage without. One daughter who answered the correspondence, directed the household, and held the family together, while her mother could not. She was not yet 20 when newspapers began publicly praising her composure in grief. And for once, the acclaim was deserved. She was 18 when she began nursing her father through his final illness. She was not yet 19 when she buried him. She married 6 months later, in a ceremony so saturated with mourning that those inside the chapel would forever afterward recall it as the saddest they had ever witnessed. Some accounts suggest she wore that tiara during the service itself. Others claim she chose a simple wreath of flowers instead, only putting on the diamonds once the mourning clothes were brought out again. This is not ultimately a story about a crown. It is the story of a woman who gave her entire life to caring for those she loved most. A father, a husband, a house full of children, and who never learned to preserve herself. History remembers her, when it remembers her at all, as a footnote beside more illustrious names. Her mother the Queen, her daughter who would become the last Empress of Russia. What she could not have known on that bleak wedding morning was that the tiara she wore would endure long after she had gone. And years later, in another country, in another sick room, she would make one small, human choice, the kind any mother has made 1,000 times, and it would cost her everything. Tonight, we tell her story. It begins in a sick room at Windsor Castle in December of 1861, where an 18-year-old princess sat at a dying man's bedside, not yet knowing how much of her life would be spent exactly that way. At Windsor that December, a small writing table had been set up just outside her father's sick room, and it was there, not at her mother's side, that young Alice spent most of her days. She personally opened the dispatches from the Prime Minister's office, She decided which letters could wait and which required her mother's signature immediately. When the Queen could not bring herself to decide, Alice decided for her, then returned to her father's sick room to sit with him until the light shifted in the window. It was not the first sick room she had ever occupied, nor would it be the last. 7 years earlier, during the Crimean War, an 11-year-old Alice had accompanied her mother and eldest sister on tours of the London hospitals, where wounded soldiers lay recovering. Small, solemn, watching rooms full of suffering men, scenes most children her age were kept far from. Her father had called her, when she was barely a year old, the beauty of the family. What he could not have foreseen was which of his 9 children would grow to be the one who could actually endure a room like that. She had not always been the daughter singled out for this kind of duty, and she was never, by her own family's admission, an easy or uncomplicated child. She was, by most accounts, the most emotionally sensitive of Queen Victoria's children, quick to absorb another's pain, but equally quick to flare into temper or answer sharply when she felt she was being managed rather than heard. Albert had taken personal charge of her education alongside an old family friend, Baron Stockmar, insisting she learn practical skills alongside her English, French, and German. Needlework, cooking, gardening, even carpentry, the kind of hands-on instruction usually deemed unnecessary for a princess. As a small girl, she was the second daughter. Clever, prone to mischief, forever standing one place behind her more brilliant older sister in the family's private theatricals. One Christmas, playing the role of Spring in a tableau staged for her parents, she scattered flowers across the floor and recited verses with, as one witness later recalled, a tone of voice sweet and penetrating. Her father, watching from his seat, used to call her, "Poor dear little Alice," as if she needed defending even then from something the rest of the family could not yet see approaching. Illness had already found her once. In 1855, a bout of scarlet fever left her constitution permanently weakened, though it did nothing to slow the pace of the plans being made for her future. The following year, her mother was already corresponding abroad to sound out a Dutch prince as a possible husband. That match never materialized. It was her elder sister's marriage 2 years later that changed Alice's position in the family for good, when Victoria left home to marry the Prussian heir in 1858. Alice became by default the eldest daughter, still living under her parents' roof, and the one onto whom her mother's attention and expectations increasingly settled. Nobody anticipated what was coming in November of 1860 either. That autumn, a young German prince named Louis of Hesse had come to Windsor for the Ascot races, and by the time he departed, Prince Albert had quietly told a friend that he anticipated further advances from the young man's family. The advance arrived a year later than hoped, but on precisely the terms the family wanted. On the night it happened, the Queen sat up late, writing in her private diary. She had noticed Alice and Louis talking by the fireplace more earnestly than usual, she wrote. And when the two of them came to her agitated, Louis asked for her blessing. I could only squeeze his hand, the Queen recorded, and say, "Certainly." She called it in her own pages, a most touching and to me most sacred moment. There was no fortune in the match and no great title either. Louis was not yet the ruler of anything, only a nephew twice removed from a minor German duchy. When Parliament came to vote on his daughter's settlement, Albert reviewed the modest sum and wrote to a friend with something close to amusement that she will not be able to do great things with it. It did not seem to matter to either of them. This was from its very first evening a marriage neither side needed. It was one they had simply chosen. They had just over a year to be happy in that plain, uncomplicated way. An engaged girl, a visiting prince, a wedding being planned for the following spring. Prince Albert, though, had spent the autumn of 1861 exhausted by a crisis that had nothing to do with his daughter's happiness. A scandal involving his eldest son's private conduct. One that had sent the prince consort out in the cold and rain to settle matters in person, and left him, by every account, more run down than anyone at court had seen him before. Then, in December, the chill he could not seem to shake turned into something worse. It began as a fever that would not lift. Within days he was too weak to rise from his bed. And it was Alice, not her elder sister now living abroad, not her mother too frightened of her own composure to trust it, who took charge of the sick room. She read to him in the hours he could still follow the words. She sat with him in the hours he could not. When the doctors finally told the family there was nothing more medicine could do, it was Alice who carried that news to her mother, and Alice who managed the household through the 9 unbearable days that followed. On the 14th of December, Prince Albert died in the presence of his wife, his eldest son, and 2 of his daughters. The Times, describing the family's conduct in the days afterward, singled Alice out by name. It is impossible to speak too highly of the strength of mind and self-sacrifice of the Princess Alice during these dreadful days. What the newspaper never printed, because no stranger ever witnessed it, was the sound of an 18-year-old girl kneeling beside her father's body, laying wreaths across his chest, saying to the companion beside her in a voice she could no longer steady, "Oh, dear Molly, let us pray to God to give us back dear Papa." He did not come back. 6 months later, on the 1st of July, 1862, Alice married Louis of Hesse, not in a church, but in the dining room at Osborne House, its table cleared away, and a makeshift altar set beneath a family portrait Albert himself had once commissioned. His own painted likeness looking down on the room from directly above the bride's head. Every guest had been ordered into mourning dress. The men in black coats and black neckcloths, the women in black or violet, so that Alice, standing at the altar in white Honiton lace and a wreath of orange blossom, was very likely the only person in the room not dressed for a funeral. She would put the mourning clothes back on again the moment the ceremony ended. Queen Victoria did not walk down any aisle. She was brought in and seated in an armchair near the altar, positioned so that her 4 sons stood between her and the sight of her daughter marrying. And she spent most of the short ceremony looking not at the couple, but at the painted face of her dead husband on the wall above them. She would later write to her eldest daughter that the day had felt more a funeral than a wedding, and told the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson simply that it was the saddest day I can remember. One biographer would later call it, without much argument from anyone who had been there, the saddest royal wedding of the century. The Archbishop of York, who conducted the service, is said to have wept, along with everyone else in the room. A sonnet printed in Punch that week called Alice, without irony, sunshine to a family in eclipse. The guests who had stood inside that room would spend the rest of their lives telling people it was the saddest wedding they had ever attended, and then almost as an afterthought, that the bride herself had not looked sad at all. That was the part no one quite knew what to do with, because in the small, unpretentious house waiting for her across the sea in a country where she knew almost no one, and where the servants who came with her from England could be counted on one hand, Alice was about to discover something her father's death had not prepared her for: a marriage that began in a room full of grief could still, against every reasonable expectation, turn into a happy one. The house waiting for her in Darmstadt was small enough that Alice could hear her husband's footsteps on the stairs from any room in it. There was no grand staircase, no ballroom, nothing like the palaces she had grown up walking through without noticing them. She and Louis rose at 7, took coffee together at 8, and spent the hour before lunch reading aloud to each other. That autumn, a novel called Westward Ho, while a household of perhaps a dozen servants learned to run a home built for a family, not a court. To the ladies in waiting who had followed her from England, it must have looked like a demotion. Alice never once described it that way. "If I say I love my dear husband, that is scarcely enough," she wrote to her mother within weeks of the wedding. "It is a love and esteem which increases daily, hourly." It was not the letter of a girl performing contentment for a grieving parent's benefit. There was no villain waiting in that small house on the quiet street near the old palace. Only a husband who adored her, and a life she had built almost entirely by her own hand. That did not mean the years ahead would be easy ones. The settlement parliament had voted her stretched thinner every year against the costs of a growing family and a household that never had quite enough money in it. And more than one visitor to Darmstadt in later years would remark carefully on how tired the marriage sometimes looked under that particular kind of strain. It was never by any honest account a story about a cruel man. It was a story about a happiness that had to be defended year after year against smaller and more ordinary enemies than that. She filled those years with work most royal wives of her rank would not have touched. Within 2 years she had made herself patroness of a lying, an institution for poor women in labor. And more than once she went to visit them herself, not from a carriage window, but on foot, incognito, through the narrowest streets of the old town. In one such visit, climbing a dark ladder into a single crowded room, she found a mother and newborn sharing one bed among 4 other children and a stove. She cooked for the family, bathed the infant's inflamed eyes herself, and returned twice more before the week was out. "If one never sees any poverty," she told her mother afterward, "one's good feelings dry up." She had learned that lesson, she said, from watching her father, but she had also unmistakably made it her own. That instinct was tested in earnest in the summer of 1866, when Hesse was pulled into a short, brutal war against Prussia, and Darmstadt's hospitals filled faster than anyone could staff them. Alice was 7 months pregnant that summer. She spent it organizing supplies, recruiting volunteers, and personally overseeing the wards anyway, writing to a woman in England she had never met, but deeply admired, Florence Nightingale, to ask in detail how it ought to be done properly. What she saw in those overcrowded wards convinced her that goodwill alone was not enough. The following year, on the 1st of June 1867, she founded the Alice, Frauenverein für Krankenpflege, a women's association for professional nursing care, built on Nightingale's own principles, that began by training 6 nurses, and would go on long after Alice herself was gone to train dozens more. Her frankness went further than her mother entirely approved of. Alice had developed by her mid-20s a serious and outspoken interest in medicine, in nursing technique, in the training of midwives, in questions of the body that Victorian drawing rooms preferred left undiscussed. She is reported to have questioned her younger, newly married sister so closely and so clinically about the physical realities of marriage that the Queen felt compelled to intervene. "Don't let Alice pump you," Victoria is said to have warned that sister in a letter of 1871. "Be very silent and cautious about your interior." It is a small, almost comic detail set against everything that would come later. Proof that the woman remembered today only for her sorrows was, in her own house, funny, direct, and entirely unembarrassed by the body's plain facts. Between 1863 and 1872, 6 children were born into that house. Victoria first, then Elizabeth, always called Ella, then Irene, then a son at last, Ernst Louis, then another son, Friedrich, then a second daughter named for the country of her mother's birth, Alex. Alice nursed each of them herself at a time, when royal mothers simply did not, and she read every book on child rearing she could obtain in either language. She was, her own letters make clear, happiest in exactly this, surrounded, outnumbered, needed by name 6 times over instead of once. It was in the middle of these crowded, contented years that something happened which had nothing to do with her children at all, and which she could not stop describing in her letters home for weeks afterward. One warm evening at Cranachstein, walking down to the pond alone to meet Louis, she passed a pale, silent man on the path. A man who neither bowed nor looked at her, walking as if he did not see her. Minutes later, her husband's grooms were shouting. A body was floating face down in the water. She and Louis pulled it into their own boat with their own hands. The face, she wrote, was already quite blue and lifeless. The man, they learned, had drowned himself. It brings death before one in its worst form, Alice wrote to her mother that night. So unlike anything else, it prevented my sleep. She had passed a living man on a garden path half an hour before. Then she had helped carry his corpse out of the water. She did not know, writing that letter, that she would spend the rest of her life becoming skilled at exactly this. The sitting up through the worst nights, the steadying of her own nerves in a sick room, the particular composure death asks of the people left standing near it. For nearly a decade, that skill had only ever been asked of her in small, survivable doses. The house on the quiet street in Darmstadt was by any fair measure a happy one. But there was a weakness running quietly through the blood of that family. One that had no name yet, that no doctor in Darmstadt or London could have warned her about. And in the autumn of 1873, it would surface for the first time in the smallest and most ordinary of her 6 children. The word itself was not new to her. 20 years earlier, her own baby brother, Leopold, had been diagnosed with the very same disease. The first case anyone in that family had ever seen. A mystery no doctor could fully explain, since neither the Queen's family nor Albert's had any record of it before him. Alice had grown up watching what that diagnosis did to a child. Her mother, terrified of losing him, kept Leopold confined to quiet rooms for most of his boyhood, away from the ordinary roughness of his brothers and sisters, watched over so closely that isolation became its own kind of suffering. Leopold, for his part, would spend much of his adult life trying to escape that same overprotection, chasing an ordinary marriage and an ordinary household of his own, almost as if it might undo what his childhood had been. Alice had married and moved to another country by the time her own son was born. She must have hoped, at least a little, that whatever had happened to her brother would not happen again. In February of 1873, a 2-year-old boy in that happy house cut his ear. It was a small thing, the kind of nick any toddler collects climbing furniture, except that it would not stop bleeding. Not that day, not the next. Since 3 days with an interruption of 1 day. Alice wrote to her mother, describing the wound. Poor Fritty has been bleeding incessantly. He is horrified at the sight of so much blood, but shows great strength as yet. Doctors were called. Cauterizing irons were used. By the time the bleeding finally stopped, the family had a word for what had happened to their 5th child. That Alice, of all people, had hoped never to hear again. Hemophilia, they called the boy Fritty, and by every account that survives him, he was the noisiest, happiest child in the house. Quick, funny, inseparable from his older brother Ernst. The 2 of them forever chasing each other between rooms that were, in a home that size, never very far apart. On the 29th of May, 3 months after the diagnosis no one had wanted, the two boys were playing in their mother's bedroom when Ernst ran off to look through a window in the next room, angled just so toward his brother's view. Alice went after him to bring him back. In the moment she was out of the room, Freddy climbed onto a chair to see where his brother had gone. The chair tipped. He went through the open window and fell 20 feet onto the stone terrace below. He survived the fall itself. That was the cruelty of it. A child, without his condition, would very likely have gotten up crying and been carried inside for a cold compress and a scolding about open windows. Freddy's blood simply would not stop moving beneath the skin where he had landed, and by that evening, the bleeding had reached his brain. He died hours later, not from the fall, but from what his own body could not do to heal itself. Ernst, not yet 6, could not be made to understand it. He told the people around him that he did not want anyone in the family ever to die alone again. That if death was coming, it should come for all of them together, so that no one would have to go, as he put it, like Freddy. Later, he described a dream to his mother, that he had died too, and gone up to heaven and asked God to give him Freddy back, and Freddy had come to him there and taken his hand. Alice, for her part, never spoke of that spring as something she recovered from. For years afterward, she kept small, private anniversaries of her son's short life, his birthday, the day he first walked, the day of the fall itself, visiting his grave in the family mausoleum on dates that meant nothing to anyone else, and finding there, she told her mother, something close to peace. There is a strange and terrible footnote buried in this loss, one the family could not have understood at the time, and one this story will return to before it ends. Freddy's death confirmed what Leopold's diagnosis had only suggested, that hemophilia now ran invisibly through more than one branch of Queen Victoria's own descendants, carried by daughters who showed no sign of it themselves. Leopold himself would not escape the disease either. 6 years after burying his young nephew, he too would die following an ordinary fall in the south of France at 30 years old. Uncle and nephew, a single hereditary weakness, and 2 nearly identical deaths a decade apart. 2 of Alice's own daughters, doctors would eventually confirm, carried that same inheritance forward into houses and thrones. Neither Alice nor her mother would live to see. Grief in that family was rarely given the luxury of standing still. The following year, in November of 1874, Alice gave birth to a 7th and final child, a daughter small and easy-tempered, whom she named Marie, and whom the household almost immediately began calling, with the particular tenderness reserved for a family's last born, May. If Freddy's death had left a hole in that house, May seemed determined from her first weeks to be the child who filled rooms with noise again. 3 years after that, in the spring of 1877, word arrived from Darmstadt that the old Grand Duke, Louis's uncle, a man who had reigned so long that almost no one at court could remember a different ruler, had finally died. Overnight, the quiet private household on the modest street became something else entirely. Louis was Grand Duke now. Alice, not yet 35, was Grand Duchess of Hesse and by Rhine, a title that came with a court to run, a state to help govern, and a level of public duty her small, close, knit family life had never once prepared her for. Friends who saw her that year noted with some concern how tired she had begun to look. She had always given more of herself than any one household needed. Now an entire duchy expected the same of her. Official visits, charitable patronages, a household staff that answered to her name instead of simply her husband's. And she did not know, could not have known, how little time remained in which to give any of it. By the autumn of 1878, The people closest to Alice had already begun to notice how tired she looked. She had been too exhausted that January to travel to Berlin for a niece's wedding, an absence that would once have been unthinkable for her. Her brother, the Prince of Wales, paid for the whole family to take a quiet holiday in Eastbourne that autumn, hoping the sea might help. It seemed to. Alice returned to the new palace at Darmstadt in good spirits that November. Ready, it seemed, for whatever the winter would ask of her next. On the evening of the 4th of November, the children gathered in one room, as they often did before bed, and it was the eldest, 15-year-old Victoria, who read aloud to the younger ones that night. Fittingly, a story called Alice in Wonderland, in a household that already had one Alice in it. Little Marie, not yet 4, was in high spirits. She leapt up at one point and begged for an extra slice of cake, and got it. No one in that room had any reason to remember the evening as anything but ordinary. By the following evening, Victoria herself was complaining of a stiff neck. The family physician, Dr. Eigenbrot, was sent for, and what he found in the back of her throat, a white membrane spreading, had a name the household had been dreading without ever saying it aloud. Diphtheria. A disease that began deceptively as little more than a sore throat and a mild fever, and could end within days by closing off a child's airway entirely. There was no cure for it in 1878, only nursing, cool compresses, careful feeding, and the grim constant watch for the moment a patient's breathing began to fail, the one intervention that might have saved a child on the edge of suffocating. A rubber tube, slid past the swollen throat to keep the airway open, was still several years from being perfected by doctors elsewhere in Europe. In the new palace that November, there was nothing to do once the membrane closed but wait and hope and change the linens. It moved through that house fast, the way it always did once it found a household with more than one child in it. Alex caught it next, then Marie, then Irene, then Ernst. 4 children falling ill within days of one another. Each diagnosis delivered to Alice in the same flat, careful tone the doctors used for all the others. Louis himself, the reigning Grand Duke, fell ill along with his children, ruler of a state that now, quietly and without any public announcement, had no one well enough to run it. Only Ella, second eldest, was spared. Alice had sent her days earlier to stay with her paternal grandmother, the Dowager Princess Charles of Hesse, before anyone understood how serious the outbreak would become. Additional doctors were summoned from beyond the household's usual physician to help manage 6 patients at once. But the nursing itself, the actual hours spent at each bedside, fell as it always had to Alice. Alice sent word to her mother by telegram, in the clipped urgent language of a woman with no time to write a proper letter. One line to say a child had fallen ill, another a day or 2 later to say a second one had, each message arriving at Windsor a little more frightening than the last. Queen Victoria, thousands of miles removed from the sick room, could do nothing but wait for the next telegram and dread what it might say. The news did not stay inside that one household for long. Alice's family was by 1878 related by blood or marriage to nearly every royal house in Europe, and word of the outbreak in Darmstadt traveled quickly along those same lines. To London, to Berlin, to relatives who could do nothing from a distance but wait for the next report and hope it would not be the one they feared. Inside the new palace, the doors to 5 separate rooms stayed closed for most of that fortnight, and Alice moved between them the way she had once moved between her father's sick room and the rest of Windsor Castle. Except that this time there was no one else to hand the burden to. She had read Florence Nightingale's writing on infection closely enough years before to know what precautions might keep her own body safe while she tended 6 others. A change of linen before entering each room. Her hands scrubbed raw between visits. Her own contact with each child measured out carefully, never lingering longer than the nursing itself required. Servants left trays outside doors and knocked rather than entered. The house that had once rung with 7 children's noise went in the space of a week almost silent. 6 patients, 1 nurse who refused to be relieved, and doctors who could offer little more than the same advice repeated from room to room: keep them still, keep them cool, and watch the throat. She did not sit and hold any of them the way a mother might have wanted to. She could not afford to. For nearly 2 weeks that discipline held, and it worked. Whatever fear moved through that house, it did not for those first 2 weeks move through Alice herself. The smallest of them all was 4-year-old Marie, fair-skinned, light-haired, blue-eyed by her mother's own description in earlier, happier letters, and so inseparable from her sister Alex that the 2 of them dressed alike and had shared a single nursery since Alex was born. It was Marie whose small body had the least strength to fight the disease with. On the 15th of November, word reached Alice that her youngest daughter had taken a sudden and serious turn, and she left whichever sick room she was already in to go to her. She did not get there in time. By the morning of the 16th, Marie was dead. The illness had closed her throat before her mother ever reached the room. 11 days earlier, this had been a child begging for an extra slice of cake at bedtime, and being given it, and thinking nothing more of the evening at all. For nearly 3 weeks, the sick children were not told. Ernst asked for his little sister more than once from his bed, and each time Alice found some gentle half-true way to answer him. Marie is resting. Marie will see you soon. Because the doctors had warned that grief on top of the disease, already working through his body, might be more than he could survive. The other children, weak and confined to separate rooms, began sending small things through the servants for their absent sister. A folded drawing, a toy, the kind of gift a child sends someone they miss. Nobody in that house corrected them. It could not hold forever. By the first days of December, the children were well enough and persistent enough that the truth could no longer be managed around. Alice sat down with Ernst, 10 years old, still weak, still recovering, and told him that Marie was dead. He would not believe it at first. Then he did, all at once, the way children do, and he broke down completely in his mother's arms. Alice held him. She had spent nearly a month doing everything her own training in nursing had taught her. The careful distance, the scrubbed hands, the linens changed before she entered any sick room, precisely so this disease could not reach her the way it had reached everyone she loved. In that moment, holding her 10-year-old son while he sobbed for his sister, she set all of it aside and kissed him. For a few days afterward, it seemed as though she had gotten away with it. Her sister, the Crown Princess of Prussia, passed through Darmstadt on her way back to England, and the 2 of them spent time together for the first time in months. Alice wrote to her mother that same day with what one biographer later called a hint of resumed cheerfulness, the first sign of anything like hope in weeks. A period publication, the Sanitary Journal, would later single out this exact moment when it warned its readers about the danger hiding inside an ordinary act of comfort. A kiss, it said, could be a kiss of death. On the 7th of December, Alice recognized the symptoms in her own throat. There was no one left in that house with the strength to nurse her the way she had nursed everyone else. Louis was still weak from his own bout with the disease. The children were only beginning to recover. The same tired doctors who had spent a month moving between 5 sick rooms now added a 6th. And this time the patient it was the Grand Duchess herself. The one person in the new palace who had never in a month of nights allowed herself to be treated as anything other than the nurse. There is no dramatic account of what came next, because by then there was no one well enough in that house to write one down. What the record shows is simpler and somehow harder to sit with. A woman who had spent nearly 2 decades perfecting the particular skill of nursing the people she loved without breaking, finally too exhausted, too grief-stricken, or simply too human to keep doing it for herself. She weakened quickly. In the small hours of the 14th of December, in a semi-conscious state, she was heard to say a few disconnected words. A date, her dead daughter's name, and finally the same 2 words she had said so many years before, kneeling as a girl over her father's own body. Dear Papa. She lost consciousness shortly after 2:30 that morning. She died just after 8. Alice, Grand Duchess of Hesse and by Rhine, was 35 years old. It was the 14th of December, the 17th anniversary to the very day of the death of Prince Albert. Queen Victoria, informed by telegram in London, sat down that same night and wrote in her own journal, struggling to make sense of what felt less like coincidence than design, that her daughter, this dear, talented, distinguished, tender-hearted, noble-minded, sweet child, who had nursed her own father in his final illness and then spent the rest of her life holding the family together, should be called back to her father on this very anniversary. The Queen wrote, seems almost incredible and most mysterious. That same afternoon, grieving in the only way she knew how, Victoria walked down to Albert's mausoleum with 3 of her surviving children and knelt by his tomb and laid wreaths there, the same gesture and the same kind of grief that her own 18-year-old daughter had once made over that very body all those years before. News of the death reached London by telegram within hours, and more telegrams followed all that day from relatives and strangers alike, faster than the grieving household at Windsor could answer them. The Times in its tribute wrote that the humblest of people felt that they had the kinship of nature with a princess who was the model of family virtue as a daughter, a sister, a wife, and a mother. Someone whose abundant sympathies sought for objects of help in the great unknown waste of human distress. The Illustrated London News put it more plainly still. Moral worth is far more important than high position. They buried Alice on the 18th of December at the new mausoleum at Rosenau, outside Darmstadt. The Union flag draped across her coffin. Exactly 1 month to the day after her daughter, Marie, had been carried to the same resting place. Her brother Leopold attended in the Queen's stead and telegraphed home afterward that the ceremony had been most impressive and very painful. At Windsor, unable to make the crossing herself, Queen Victoria held her own private service. At the same hour the coffin was lowered in Darmstadt, surrounded by whichever of her children could reach her in time. The strawberry leaf tiara, the piece her father had designed for a wedding he never lived to see, the piece she had worn through 16 years of a marriage nobody had arranged for her, passed along with everything else she owned into the keeping of the family she left behind. It would not stay quiet in a drawer for long. Within 20 years, another young bride in that same family would lift it out of its case and put it on for a coronation in Moscow, not knowing, or not yet knowing, everything that particular piece of jewelry still had left to witness. In June of 1896, a young woman climbed the steps of the Kremlin's Cathedral of the Dormition, wearing the same diamonds Alice had once worn beneath a floral wreath at her own wedding. She was Victoria Melita, a niece who had grown up hearing about the aunt she never met, now married to that aunt's only surviving son, Ernst. The coronation she attended that week was for her husband's cousin, Nicholas II of Russia. His bride was the former Princess Alex of Hesse. Once the 6-year-old girl diagnosed with diphtheria in the same terrible November that took her little sister. Alice's youngest surviving daughter was now Empress of all the Russias. Somewhere in that cathedral, catching the light, sat the tiara her grandfather Albert had never lived to see finished. The blood that killed Freddy in 1873 did not end with him. Alex carried it into the Russian imperial family, where it would shape one of the great hidden crises of that court. A bleeding disorder in her only son that she and her husband kept desperately secret, and which left an empress desperate enough to place her trust in a wandering monk named Rasputin. Irene, another of Alice's daughters, carried the same inheritance into the Prussian royal house. Somewhere in that quiet, invisible legacy was the last thing Alice ever passed down to her children without meaning to. It would not be a happy inheritance to carry in other ways either. 22 years after that coronation, in a cellar in Yekaterinburg, the Empress Alexandra was murdered alongside her husband and children by revolutionaries who spared no one in the house. Her sister Elizabeth, Alice's other surviving daughter, by then a nun, was killed within a day of her in a mine shaft outside a different provincial town. Two sisters who had once slipped drawings under a nursery door for a sick baby sister they were not allowed to see, did not in the end live to be much older than their mother had. The tiara itself was elsewhere by then, back in the family's keeping in Germany through one world war, and most of a second, until November of 1937, when it was packed into a locked case for a wedding in London. The aircraft carrying it went down over Belgium. A great-grandson of Alice's, married only 2 years, died in the crash along with his wife, his 2 young sons, and his own mother. When rescuers searched the wreckage, they found the case. Inside it, untouched by the fire that had taken everyone who loved it, sat the tiara Prince Albert had designed for a wedding 76 years before, that he did not live to see either. Some of what Alice built outlived the family more gently than the tiara did. The nursing organization she had founded in Darmstadt, training women to care for the sick and wounded exactly as she once had, kept operating for decades after her death through 2 more wars, long after anyone running it could have said why it carried her name. It is not the kind of inheritance anyone puts behind glass. It is easy, looking at old photographs of Alice, to see only what came after the epidemic. The shuttered rooms, the anniversary too exact to be an accident. Her own letters remember other things as well. A young wife reading Westwood Ho! Aloud each evening with a husband who adored her more, she wrote. With every year that passed, a woman with a stranger's blood still on her hands, one warm evening at Kranigstein, unable to sleep for what she had seen in the water. A Grand Duchess climbing a dark ladder into the poorest room in Darmstadt to bathe a sick infant she had never met, and telling almost no one that she had gone. The tiara sits behind glass today in a private vault in Germany, taken out perhaps once a decade for an exhibition. Visitors who know nothing of Alice or her father or the 7 children whose names are carved nowhere on the case pause for a moment to admire the diamonds, and then move on to whatever is in the next room.